The sound does not come from guns. It comes at 3 in the morning from a typewriter that will not stop. Clack, clack, clack. The rhythm is steady, worn down to a metallic fatigue. A paper tape whispers out of another machine like a grey river with no end. The room carries the odour of old paper, cheap coffee, and the sharp mix of sweat and tobacco. A lampshade gathers the light and drops a dim yellow island onto mountains of files. This is England, Bletchley Park, 1941 or 1942. Outside the window is a typical countryside night, quiet, perhaps foggy. No searchlights rake the sky. No bomber engines roll over the roofline. Everything is so calm it barely feels like war. And yet the war is here, in this room. A man whose name you will never learn, call him an analyst, rubs bloodshot eyes and bends back over his desk. Spread in front of him are cipher tables, frequency counts, and pages of tentative guesses. He has just finished a round of cross-checking. The result is subtle but unmistakable. A string of letters that looked like noise begins to show the skeleton of German. It might point to a convoy route. It might point to a U-boat resupply coordinate. He rings for a courier. A slip of paper is placed into a folder, handled as if it could burn, and carried to the building next door. Another team is waiting there. They will decide what happens next to this small piece of meaning. The whole process is quiet, orderly, almost dull. But inside a few square meters of hush, in the tapping of keys and the friction of paper, a battle you cannot see is being fought. A few nautical miles away in the Atlantic, a merchant ship may alter course because of this. A few hundred miles away in the deserts of North Africa, a deception plan may be set in motion because of this. Here a comma can ripple outward into life and death. War rages at sea and in the air where flesh and steel collide. But the first trigger of decision is often pulled in places like this. Rooms with no smoke, only endless paper and coffee stains. The people here weave another kind of victory with mind and patience. They are soldiers on a different front. Their weapons are logic, probability, and a patience so deep it feels bottomless. So what is happening in this quiet room? How do signals refined out of noise cross walls of secrecy and become battlefield advantage? And why was it all buried in silence until decades later, when the world finally saw it clearly? This story begins with that silent trigger. But be warned. What follows is not a myth about a lonely genius. It is a truth about how a vast machine works. To understand why this silence can be lethal, you must understand the enemy they faced. The enemy was not a single soldier, it was a machine and the system that surrounded it. Its name is famous, Enigma. Many people misunderstand Enigma. They imagine it as a magical device that, once cracked by a brilliant mind, makes everything easy. That was never the real danger. Enigma's true power was not that it could never be broken, but that it was broken anew every day. Picture the German command posts scattered across Europe and North Africa, Luftwaffe bases, and especially the U-boats that haunted the Atlantic. They all used Enigma to encrypt messages. The operator typed ordinary letters. Inside the machine, rotors stepped and reflected electrical paths, and out came gibberish with no visible pattern. The receiver used another Enigma set to the exact same configuration, and the message returned to plain text. Security lived in that phrase, the exact same configuration. Rotor order and initial positions were set by a daily keybook shared only within German units. If the sender and receiver matched that setup, the gibberish became plain text again. That daily reset is everything. You are not facing one fixed lock that stays open forever once you discover its key. You are facing a lock rebuilt at dawn, according to a codebook only the enemy has. Yesterday's success does not help you today. Yesterday's key is worthless this morning. At best, yesterday gives you habits. Which units tend to use which formats, what kinds of phrases might appear in a routine report, and how operators behave when they are rushed. But the mechanical barrier resets. The door you pried open yesterday is rebuilt before breakfast. So Bletchley Park's mission was never to find a mythical master key. Their mission was harsher. Within the lifespan of today's lock, usually 24 hours, find a way in, read what is inside, and then do it all again before tomorrow's lock changes shape. This is not a one-time sprint of brilliance. It is a systematic war of attrition, repeated day after day, against time itself. Later official accounts and historical research describe that attrition as a set of gears that meshed with relentless precision. First came process discipline. From the moment a signal was intercepted, it entered an engineered assembly line, logged, classified, and routed based on its characteristics and sender to different huts. Each hut specialized. Some handled certain traffic types like Army and Air Force Enigma in Hut 6 and Naval Enigma in Hut 8. Others handled stages of work like language analysis and traffic analysis. Individual genius mattered, but it was embedded inside a collective process where one person's insight was useless unless it could be tested, confirmed, and carried forward by others. Second came the hunt for cracks in human behavior. Even the tightest system depends on people. German operators got tired, they cut corners, they made predictable mistakes. Repeated headers, fixed daily weather reports, a habitual greeting or sign-off, tiny violations of perfect cryptographic hygiene. Those small human fissures became leverage points. The analysts were using the enemy's imperfections against the machine's apparent perfection. Third came computation at scale. This is where the bomb entered, not a computer that thinks, but an electromechanical brute force creature built to churn through possibilities with mechanical speed and relentless stamina. It did not reason the way a person reasons. It provided something different, the ability to test enormous spaces of possible settings fast enough to keep pace with the daily reset. Memoirs describe the workrooms as rows of bombs, buzzing and throwing off heat like a factory floor. Women operators paced the lines, swapping paper tapes and monitoring the machinery. Analysts watched the output spool and waited for the improbable moment when nonsense collapsed into readable German. The atmosphere was usually tense silence, broken now and then by a low exclamation or a tired sigh. There was no cinematic scream of revelation. There was only exhaustion, persistence, and then, if method and luck aligned, a brief release. A pencil scratches. A page is stamped and passed along. Someone makes a quiet correction. Then the room returns to the same steady concentration. Success is not celebrated loudly, because the next day's work is already waiting. So, breaking Enigma was not a movie scene where a genius stares at the ceiling and suddenly knows. It was a noisy, frustration-filled intellectual factory whose product was a narrow intelligence window for today, and that window closed fast. Now assume today's work succeeds. The window cracks. You can see inside, clear and deadly. U-boat Wolfpack assembling in North Atlantic grid AD-35. Expected to ambush convoy HX-229 within 48 hours. Are you thrilled? Of course. There is the satisfaction of a hard problem solved, mixed with the urgent hope of saving lives. Is victory in sight? No. Not close. The most dangerous phase begins now, because now you face a problem even more delicate than the cipher itself. You know a secret, and you must use it without letting the enemy suspect the source. How do you save the convoy and its sailors without creating even the faintest doubt in the mind of a German U-boat officer that the supposedly impregnable daily reset Enigma has been turned into plain text on a British desk? If you order the Royal Navy's best destroyers to rush straight to the coordinate, or if you make the convoy execute a sharp, inexplicable right-angle turn, what happens? The German commander writes in his war diary, "Something is wrong. Allied action is too precise. Is it coincidence? A leak? Or are our communications being read?" One moment of suspicion could trigger a full review. The Germans might adopt a more complex procedure or shift to an entirely new cipher system. Months of effort, the whole factory's hum, thousands of tired eyes could drop to zero overnight. You win today and you lose tomorrow, and the next day and the next. A successful break is not the finish line. It is a fragile admission ticket into a more dangerous game, how to use intelligence without exposing its source, how to win tactically without sacrificing the strategic asset. In practice, that meant ruthless compartmentalization. Even within Bletchley, not everyone saw the same material, and outside it only a narrow circle could receive the most sensitive product. Information had to move quickly, but it moved through controlled channels, pared down to what a commander needed and stripped of anything that might reveal how it was obtained. To play that game, step back and watch how intelligence is born out of chaos and made safe enough to touch. It does not arrive as prophecy. It travels. Imagine the life of one piece of information, from its creation to its use. The start might be a German U-boat command office in Lorient, France. A staff officer drafts an assembly order. A radio operator turns it into Morse, dots and dashes crossing the Atlantic's heavy sky. The endpoint we want is Liverpool, a huge map on the wall at Western Approaches Command, a red marker pinned to the HX229 route. But between those points is not a straight line. It is an ocean filled with sound. Allied listening stations across the world acted like giant ears day and night, catching invisible radio waves. From Scotland's barren coasts to Gibraltar's rock, from Malta's underground shelters to outposts on frozen tundra, they collected everything, every day. Tens of thousands of messages, encrypted and unencrypted, vital and trivial, real and deliberately misleading, surged toward Bletchley Park like a winter Atlantic storm. This was the convergence point. And what arrived was mostly noise, irrelevant tactical chatter, sprawling logistics, personal small talk, even muddled conversations among Axis partners. The gold-plated U-boat order hid somewhere inside this flood. It might be only a few dozen characters, easy to miss among tens of thousands of transmissions. So the first step of the workflow was not decryption, it was triage, it was panning for gold, separating signal from noise. Institutional histories and later researchers describe a complex, efficient system of sorting and prioritization inside Bletchley. Think of an emergency room triage desk, or an early ancestor of the modern trending algorithm. Experienced officers, linguists, and communications experts made fast decisions. They scanned messages quickly. Even when the content was fully encrypted, external features, frequency, call signs, length, signal strength, transmission location, revealed a great deal. Using knowledge and instinct, they attached labels. This signal looks like Rommel's Africa Corps command, likely about supplies. Priority B. This cipher style is unusual and the source is steady. It may reflect high-level discussion in Berlin. Mark A and rush it to Hut 3 for coordination and synthesis. This batch is routine naval U-boat status reports. Huge volume, highly regular, excellent material for tracking patterns and morale. Send it to Hut 8, the Naval Enigma team led by Turing, for bulk analysis. These are weak signals, trivial content, no immediate tactical value. File them or keep them as background noise samples. This was a brutal decision about a scarce resource: attention. Decryption consumes what is most precious: time, limited bomb hours, and the sustained focus of top analysts. You cannot afford to spend those resources on every scrap of noise. You must decide, and sometimes gamble, which messages might contain intelligence capable of shifting the odds in a sea zone or an entire campaign. The process was saturated with uncertainty. A cautious call could make you miss a treasure that might turn a battle. An optimistic misread could burn days on carefully disguised trash. By some accounts, pressure on the sorting posts was intense, decisions made in minutes, even seconds, relying on deep familiarity with enemy habits, order of battle, and even commander personalities, plus an instinct repeatedly corrected by reality. Now assume our U-boat message is lucky. Its urgent call sign format and known command chain signature get it marked highest urgency and delivered to Hut 8. It joins the queue. Hours pass. Analysts test cribs and assumptions. Machines churn. And then, at some point, a rotor combination locks in, the ice breaks, and German plain text flows out onto a strip of paper. Only then does it complete its metamorphosis, emerging from an ocean of noise as a scarce, fragile signal. But even now, it is naked. It is raw decrypt output, still carrying the scent of its source. The number of people who know it must be squeezed to the smallest circle. It is like red-hot iron. You do not pass it around bare-handed. It needs a cover, a legitimate identity that lets it walk into daylight and land on a commander's desk without burning anyone. It needs a story, one the enemy could trace backward without ever suspecting the cipher. Here is where the intelligence business becomes most theatrical and most ruthless. The dramatic moment is not the breakthrough itself. It is the long masquerade afterward. The coldest rule is simple. The dance must be perfect. One wrong step does not merely expose you. It kills the most important agent feeding you intelligence. In this story, that agent is your own capability, the ability to read Enigma, which must be protected at all costs. Historians later named this the secrecy paradox, or the ultra dilemma. The more successful intelligence is, the more it must remain invisible. The smarter you are, the more you must persuade the enemy you are not. The ability to read Enigma was treated as a national core secret, more important than the outcome of any single battle. It had to be protected like eyesight itself. That meant every piece of information from this channel had to undergo surgical transformation before it left Bletchley Park for the Admiralty, Fighter Command, or the Prime Minister's War Cabinet. How do you operate on intelligence until it looks like something else? The essential technique was to create a plausible alternative source, one the enemy could accept. A precise U-boat coordinate, lifted word for word from Enigma, might be rewritten in an Admiralty summary as, "A Liberator long-range patrol aircraft reported an indistinct radar contact this afternoon in adverse weather. In light of recent activity patterns in the area, Western Approaches recommends convoy HX229 consider a minor southern course adjustment." In ground operations, the language might shift again. Reliable intelligence from the Emerald Agent Network, requiring the highest protection, indicates the enemy 21st Panzer Division's logistics convoy will pass the Route 67 defile tomorrow at dusk. The so-called Emerald Network might never have produced that exact detail at all, or might have offered only vague hints later used to support the precise decrypt. The people who performed these transformations worked closely with the synthesis and distribution offices. Their job demanded a different kind of intelligence, not only ciphers and German, but a grasp of military operations, the limits of reconnaissance, and the psychology of commanders. They were scriptwriters. They had to craft narratives their own generals would trust, and that enemy intelligence officers would shrug off as bad luck. Their pen was a weapon, quieter than a bomb, sometimes more decisive. They took certainty and diluted it into probability. They hid, we read it, inside multiple corroborating sources, or a fortunate technical intercept. Sometimes, to make the story credible, they would send an aircraft to the target area for a token sweep, returning with harmless weather observations or irrelevant radio noise, and then package the essential decrypt with real but useless edge material. This caution created the harshest strategic and ethical dilemma in intelligence work. If protecting the source requires thick disguise, what happens when that disguise produces hesitation, vague orders, or missed fleeting opportunities? More brutally, what happens when you know an Allied convoy will sail into a perfect U-boat kill zone, but you have no aircraft, no ships, no scouts nearby who could provide a clean reason to warn them or intervene? Post-war studies emphasize the answer is sometimes unbearable. You endure the loss. To protect the long-term strategic asset, the capability that might save tens of thousands, you accept tactical bloodshed. This is the darkest base of the intelligence pyramid, a corner the light does not reach. The inner fracture borne by those who made, or helped make, those decisions is not easily compared to battlefield courage. A wartime official mentioned in declassified records, identity still obscured, left a note describing how they watched, in great pain, certain ships proceed into known danger, unable to give a warning clean enough to force a decisive course change. The helplessness and guilt of holding the answer and staying silent was later described as more draining than the decryption itself. So the advantage of intelligence is never omniscience, never a godlike freedom. It is a dance in heavy shackles, balanced on a knife edge. You know what matters, but you must pretend you learned it by ordinary means. And sometimes, because you know too precisely, you are forced to pay the price of knowing. Now return to the message's journey. It begins in a silent room. It survives the ocean of noise and the long night of decryption. It enters the transformation room, where it is carefully disguised and dressed in a safe outer layer. It now looks like a lucky reconnaissance contact, a courageous agent's report, or a seasoned admiral's intuition. Only then can it be sent onward to the real battlefield, where it faces the only test that matters. So what can this hard-won, now safe intelligence actually do? How does it prove that all the disguises and all the heavy choices were worth it? The right measure is not the decisive blow, it is the shift in probability. Pull back from the paper piles and cut to wider space through a kind of historical parallel edit. Scene A. Bletchley Park. In Hut 8, an analyst decrypts and verifies a message and sends it to the synthesis office. After transformation, a warning labeled Source, Direction Finding and Route Pattern Analysis is transmitted to the Admiralty in London. Scene B. At Western approaches, a staff officer receives it, integrates it into the daily summary, and adds a recommendation. Convoy HX229's current route may intersect a potential threat zone. Weather permitting, consider adjusting course south by 10 to 15 nautical miles. The order is encrypted and sent to sea. Scene C, mid-Atlantic. The escort commander reads the message on a rolling flagship. He trusts the analysts back home, even though the stated reason sounds vague. He weighs fuel costs and risk and orders a minor course adjustment. No alarm bells, no battle stations, just a quiet turn. Scene D. Days later, a patrol report notes dense U-boat wireless traffic in the area of the original route. Frustrated communications from submarines that waited too long and found nothing. The convoy slips past the wolf pack. Thousands of sailors and tens of thousands of tons of cargo pass quietly through the shadow of death. No explosions, no firefight, no direct sighting. A planned ambush and a potential massacre dissolve because of a small course change justified by vague intelligence. The war report will simply record, HX229 arrived, losses below expectations. The cause might be credited to good seamanship or unpredictable weather. This is Bletchley Park's most representative value. It rarely maps neatly onto a famous battle won because of a decrypt. More often its contribution dissolves into broader curves. Allied monthly merchant losses dropping from crisis peaks. U-boat killing efficiency, tons sunk per submarine per month. Declining, vital supplies reaching Britain with increasing quantity and predictability. Historians and economists later tried to quantify the effect. One shared conclusion is that it significantly changed the war's cost curve. It did not make the Allies invulnerable. It made the Germans feel luck was turning against them, operations becoming harder. It gave Allied commanders more confidence and, critically, more lead time. Researchers put it this way. It compressed Allied uncertainty while widening German decision fog. In North Africa, Montgomery could strike Axis fuel and supply columns with striking precision before El Alamein, as if he always knew when and where they would move. The stated sources might be continuous air reconnaissance or agent networks. In the Allied landings in North Africa, Torch, and in later campaigns in Europe, some of the ability to anticipate German deployments and reactions also came from the steady reading of encrypted traffic. These victories are recorded in official histories and credited to frontline courage, commander's skill, and industrial strength. The quiet manner where the first key clues emerged rarely appears in public commendations. That is the price of secrecy, and also part of what makes the contribution both complex and profound. It had to remain anonymous. So we cannot, like a chemistry equation, declare a percentage. This much of El Alamein belongs to Bletchley Park. War is a complex system. Victory is the non-linear interaction of countless factors. Bletchley's contribution is better described as systemic enablement. It is like installing a nervous system and a predictive model into a vast war machine. The machine's eventual success depends on engines, industry, muscles, armed forces, bones, logistics, and the nervous system working together. If you remove that nervous system, the machine still moves, but it moves with less warning and more waste. With it, the same forces can be applied earlier, more selectively, and with fewer blind shocks. GCHQ, the institutional heir in spirit and structure, describes Bletchley Park in its official historical narrative as one of the essential factors in Allied victory and an indispensable decisive node in the evolution of British signals intelligence. The phrasing is careful and forceful. It places Bletchley at the center without falling into single-cause myth-making. Real history is woven from many such crucial threads. When the guns finally fell silent in Europe in May 1945, victory celebrations swept across the Allied world. Streamers, flowers, embraces, tears. People from Bletchley Park went into the streets too, but their feelings were often more complicated. They knew they had helped do something immense, but how immense? They could not talk about it. They packed quietly, destroyed unneeded files, and handed over equipment. Many could not explain to spouses or parents what they had done for years. The world took the glory of victory. They and every method and detail of their work were sealed into a time capsule by an order harsher than wartime itself. It was not only secrecy, it was enforced forgetting. With the long Cold War looming, the techniques, experience, and ways of thinking forged at Bletchley had to be kept as hidden trump cards. For national security, this history had to remain silent. The silence lasted not years, but nearly a generation. A monument was built and then deliberately buried. The war ended, but another, subtler global confrontation began almost immediately. Enigma became history, but the duel between encryption and decryption moved into new electronic dimensions. The technologies refined in wartime, early electronic computing prototypes like Colossus, analytical methods, and the training of an entire generation of cryptographers and intelligence analysts became core assets for Britain and its allies in Cold War intelligence, sometimes more valuable than new weapons. So, the wartime secrecy order was not lifted. It was reinforced and institutionalized. Many staff departing Bletchley signed lifelong secrecy obligations. That forced silence seeped into post-war lives and shaped a distinctive emotional experience. A former female staffer said in a late-life interview that she could tell her boyfriend, later her husband, only that she had done clerical and translation work for a government department. When he pressed, she had to be vague or change the subject, and the distance sometimes hurt. A cryptanalyst recalled that at alumni gatherings years later, even when former colleagues recognized one another, they would simply raise a glass in quiet acknowledgement and never touch the work itself. They shared a gigantic national secret and then returned to ordinary life, carrying it alone. For some, the secrecy became a private form of service that continued long after the fighting stopped. For others, it became a quiet weight they could never quite set down. For the public and for historians, the grand narrative of World War II hardened quickly. People spoke of Normandy's peril, Stalingrad's slaughter, Midway's turning point, and the horror of the camps. About Signal's intelligence and Bletchley Park, only scattered stories circulated privately, often dismissed as rumor. When books or articles brushed close to the edges, they met official denial, warning, or quiet suppression. In official war histories, Bletchley's existence was minimized, its contribution blurred, its mechanisms left unnamed. The first crack in the ice came in the 1970s. As time passed and the Cold War stabilized, the technology of 30 years earlier became obsolete. The young workers of the war years grew gray-haired. Some died with secrets intact. The strategic imperative of absolute secrecy gradually gave way to a social demand for historical transparency. Perceptive historians, such as Britain's Harry Hinsley, himself a former intelligence analyst at Bletchley, began, using limited declassified material and cautious oral histories, to piece together the hidden mural. In 1974, the former Royal Air Force officer F.W. Winterbotham published The Ultra Secret. The book landed like a boulder in still water. Ultra was the code name for intelligence derived from breaking top-level ciphers like Enigma, and from that moment, the term entered public view. The details were contested. The official response was awkward, but the door had been forced open, and it could not be shut again. The official floodgates began to open, slowly and carefully. The British government released relevant files in selective batches. The land at Bletchley Park, once ultra-secret, was gradually recognized as historic heritage and eventually became a museum open to the public. Its exhibitions, grounded in rigorous scholarship, offered the first authoritative institutional framework for telling the story. Dusty archive boxes were opened one after another. The paper had yellowed. Carbon copy text was faint. Telegraph slips were brittle. Historians worked like archaeologists, brushing and sorting. They found that the truth was more complex than wartime legend and post-war speculation, and more astonishing. What emerged was not a simple heroic tale of one breakthrough, but a massive, precise, highly organized system that still carried human warmth and strain. There were routines and spreadsheets of their era, shift rosters and control rooms, rules about who could see what, and constant pressure to keep the pipeline moving. There was joy at breakthroughs and collective anxiety during dry spells, and the daily grinding obligation to do it again tomorrow. In some declassified internal memos and late-life interviews, mid- to senior-level decision-makers, finally allowed to shed part of the burden, spoke about certain actions not with pride, but with a complex release, an exhale, sometimes a lingering regret over specific choices. Breaking the silence did not always feel like a coronation. Sometimes it felt like the end of a long private trial. When the dust settled and the full picture appeared, the world finally saw what had been there all along. Bletchley Park was not one or two brilliant figures crowned with halos. It was an entire pyramid of intelligence, roaring in wartime silence, hidden by post-war silence. Its product was not a handful of dramatic turning points. It was a steady stream of high-quality information increments feeding Allied decisions, shifting the hydrology and climate of the entire war. The secret reached the 1970s. Fully grasping its weight, complexity, and modern echo would take longer still, and may never truly end. So return, one last time, to that room at 3 in the morning. The steady clack of a typewriter, the rustle of paper tape feeding through, a coffee pot simmering on a burner, the occasional low-voiced exchange. Those sounds are the story's original palette and its most durable symbol. Bletchley Park's story, as it speaks to us now, has moved beyond an unearthed wartime secret. It reads like a modern parable about how we understand complex worlds and the forces that change them. First, it shows that confronting massive systemic uncertainty, war or any other complex challenge, rarely comes down to a lone spark of inspiration. It comes down to engineering at the system level, rigorous process design, fine-grained division of labor, continuous iteration of tools and technology, and the collective endurance required to filter, analyze, and synthesize oceans of information. The miracle is the factory's daily output, brick by brick, night after night. Second, it explains the philosophy of invisible advantage. True, sustainable strategic advantage often sits inside the opponent's blind spot, like an iceberg whose mass is below the waterline. The highest form of intelligence is not boasting, "I know everything about you." It is making what you know appear ordinary to the enemy, as if gained through mundane channels rather than through the forbidden act of breaking the cipher. The ability to hide yourself, to blur causality on purpose, is its own form of strength. It demands restraint. It means accepting that the public story of a success may be incomplete, even inside your own organization. It means letting others take the credit so the advantage can keep working. Third, it offers a healthier way to judge history and contribution. Be wary of myth-making simplicity. Be willing to embrace engineering-level complexity. Do not obsess over the decisive blow. Watch instead for the quiet shift in the probability curve. Bletchley Park did not win the war by itself, but it undeniably systematically improved the Allies' chances while lowering the cost of victory. That embedded, process-level enablement carries historical weight equal to any famous battle. Finally, this is a story about time, silence, and memory. Some truths require distance before they can safely surface. Some contributions require a wider context to be understood. Silence is not always forgetting. Sometimes it is a protection mechanism, an extension of the work into the dimension of time, until conditions allow the full narrative to be handed to the future. So the secret reached the 1970s is not merely a timestamp. It is a metaphor. It reminds us that the forces that move history often churn in quiet rooms beyond the spotlight, and that what shapes the world is often careful, disciplined, day-after-day labor that shifts a system's probabilities. Today, when visitors walk through the museum at Bletchley Park and listen to the monotone echoes of old typewriters and Bombe replicas, they are not hearing a distant, sanctified past. They are hearing the reverberation of a workflow, a methodology, a way of thinking, how, under extreme constraints, rationality, collaboration, patience, and organization can build order out of chaos. How to catch signal inside noise. How, under absolute secrecy, to transform knowledge born in a silent room into better outcomes the real world can accept. That steady clack, in a sense, never truly stopped. It still echoes faintly through the corridor of history, reminding anyone willing to listen. The deepest change, the strongest victory, often begins in the quietest room, in the most restrained, most persistent keystroke. And true understanding begins when we stop hunting only for heroes and start learning to read the silent factory.